Here we go with this third panel of the 30th Farm Aid Agripalooza and all-out hoorah that we're having here in the church. And here's our distinguished, good-looking bunch. For this one, we're back with a couple of the usual suspects. We got David Center with us. We've got Mark Ritchie as well. And then we've brought in as well Shirley Sherrod. You're going to hear wonderful things by her. George Naylor out of Iowa. And then we've got Mary Ellen Lloyd with us as well. Terrific. And Pat Sweeney out of Montana. Am I right? Montana, yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. Somewhere out there. Carolyn, in her material she put together for our little confab, noted that this 30th anniversary is a milestone, and indeed it is a milestone not only for Farm Aid, but also for the good food culture that Farm Aid has helped to nurture over these last 30 years. It's important, as Carolyn indicated, to glance back and realize that things like this don't just happen, as Mark Ritchie was saying earlier in his panel. They're created, things like Farm Aid and movements, by circumstances, by upheavals, social, economic, political, cultural. And then they're shaped by activists, by agitators, by advocates, by artists, like are all gathered here for Farm Aid. Then they spread, become diversified, and deepen because of allies, advocates, organizers, and communicators that we bring into it. And if all goes well, it might become a movement. And if it becomes a movement, then it almost inevitably becomes successful. But it's also important, I think, to comprehend that what we've been doing in the past 30 years, what we're going to be doing in the next 30 years, fits into a rebellious, populist continuum of America's larger democratic history. What I'm saying here is that you're not alone. We've been here before, not you and me literally, but certainly spiritually, carrying on for those radicals and rabble-rousers of 1776 who were battling not just King George III, but also the moneyed corporations such as the British East India Trading Company. Carolyn and Alicia asked me to take a couple of moments here at the top to put Farm Aid and the good work that you're all doing in the grand context, not just of the last 30 years, but of the last 300 years. The powers that be don't connect these dots for us in the history classes or on the History Channel, but the true essence of the American spirit is rebellion. That's what America's all about. That's our character, inherently rebellious. And the central issue that has always driven this rebellion and our politics is this: too few people control too much of the money and power, and they use that control to get more for themselves at our expense. So you can think of that core reality of our politics just in terms of the generations of farm families who've battled the elites to democratize money and power over the years. That's what Shays' Rebellion was all about in the 1780s, when Revolutionary War soldiers came home to find that John Adams and the other elites of the Revolution had stolen their farms from them. That's what the historic, astonishingly successful populist movement of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s was all about. When hundreds of thousands of farmers in more than 40 states, from New York to California, rebelled against the rip-offs by the banks and the railroads, rebelled against the sellout politicians of both the Democratic and Republican parties. They organized local, state, national farmers' alliances to create a grassroots cooperative commonwealth, they called it. They had co-ops to finance, to harvest, to store, to transport, and to market their crops. They built an entire alternative economy to the corporate structure of the day. Then they built their own political party, not just for themselves. The People's Party was the first to call for women's suffrage in this country. It was the first to support 40-hour work week for labor, the first to call for direct election of United States senators rather than being chosen by legislatures that they did that. First to call for anti-monopoly laws, first to call for many firsts back in the day. It's also this spirit of rebelliousness, what Fighting Bob LaFollette and his aggressive, progressive party was doing up here in our neighbor, Wisconsin, and then all across the country in the 19-teens and 20s. Fighting Bob LaFollette ran for president, I believe it was 1924, got 25% of the vote. Probably the biggest share of third party at any time that did not succeed. That's what the farm holiday movement and the penny auctions that we heard about earlier were about in the 1920s and 30s. That's what the creation and actions of the National Farmers Union has been about for the past 100 years. That's what the American agricultural movement and its in-your-face tractorcades were about in the 1970s and 80s, and now us. A broad coalition daring to say, hell no. A coalition of agitators. You know, they call you an agitator if you do anything. If you're in a union and you stand up and they say, oh, well, our workers were perfectly happy in that factory till those union agitators came in here. Poor people didn't mind living up against that toxic waste dump until those environmental agitators came in here. Well, hogwash and horse hockey, agitation is what built America. And remember, that agitator is the center post in the washing machine that gets the dirt out. We need a lot more of that. So we're here today saying no to the Goldman Sachers and the Monsanto Frankensteiners and all the other plutocrats, autocrats, and kleptocrats trying to strip the culture out of agriculture. There's a word for what they're trying to do, a technical term. It's called stealing. Woody Guthrie had a song about outlaws. It says, through this world I travel, I see lots of funny men. Some will rob you with a six-gun and some with a fountain pen. But it's through this world I travel and it's through this world I roam. I never see an outlaw drive a family from their home. That's what we're talking about right there. That's the big theft. So I come to you not just from Austin, Texas, but from South Austin. We have a little more irreverent attitude over there south of the river. And our unofficial slogan is, we're all here because we're not all there. And I think that's what brings us together, because we know that the powers that be are not at all there on America's radical, historic, beautiful idea of creating a society that is rooted in the democratic values of economic fairness, social justice, equal opportunity for all people. That's what we're about building. That's the big idea behind all of our efforts. It's not just about another dollar a bushel on this or that. It's not about another dime in wage. It's not about technical stuff. It's about moral values, a farm and food economy with a moral center that is bigger than the shriveled, narcissistic nub of corporate profiteering. We're looking for a good food culture that's good for families, good for communities, good for nature, good for democracy, good for the next generations. Some say it can't be done. The corporate powers have all the money. They got the politicians. They control it all, so might as well give it up. But as a friend of mine who's been a pioneer in the organic movement put it to me once, he said, Hightower, those who say it can't be done should not interrupt those who are doing it. And that would be you. Good folks at a grassroots level who are doing it, making it happen. So I'm here merely to say, keep at it, only more so. Forge coalitions, do more collaboration among our individual efforts. Merge into a real movement and just keep going. I'll leave you with this thought. It's from a moving company when I first moved down to Austin in the late mid-70s. There was a moving company there. It was just a little bitty outfit, two big guys with a truck, you know. named Skeeter and Booger, I think that was their names. And but they had a great attitude and a great advertising slogan. This moving company said, if we can get it loose, we can move it. That's what we're talking about. Get it loose at a grassroots level, and the people will move it for themselves. That's what you're doing. Thank you for doing that. Let's go now. So let's get now back to our great panel here, folks who have been in this fight for a long, long time and been making a difference, who can help us understand where we came from and where we might be going. And the focus this time is the Farm Aid's Food and Ranch Congress. It was held in St. Louis back in 1986. My joy to be there with all of these good folks and Willie Nelson. It was a stupendous occasion that rendered quite a bit of benefits, and we'll talk about that later too. Let me start with David Center again, because this was a huge rally, but David, it didn't just happen spontaneously. Where did this idea come from?
Well, Jim, first I want to say amen, Brother Jim, on your comments leading into this. You know, the United Farm and Ranch Congress was an amazing, grassroots, successful campaign. In 1985, the year Farm Aid started, Congress passed a very bad farm bill that removed price supports, lowered commodity prices, and just added to the spiraling farm prices. There was a congressional leader in agriculture made the statement that we here in Congress know what's better for farmers than they know themselves. Well, that statement did not amuse a number of us that had been working on legislation. And so an idea came together. Let's go out and talk to farmers. Let's let farmers write a farm bill. Let's take that bill to Washington and let's see what they think about it. And so out of that, the United Farm and Ranch Congress, Farm Aid, stepped forward and provided a neutral stage where all the grassroots organizations, a lot of national organizations could all step on and avoid the turf fights, come together. We went out into the country, and in the Farm Aid office, I was there in July, there is a box of documents. Every single sign-in sheet from over 2,000 county meetings are there with who attended, who was elected delegates, and the resolutions that were adopted. So, in 44 states, over 2,000 local meetings, it was an amazing process, and the resolutions were so similar. But the Farm and Ranch Congress, when all the delegates, 2,000 came together, there was 400 voting delegates or so, the resolutions were adopted. The 1987 Credit Act were from the resolutions that were adopted at the Farm and Ranch Congress. It was passed in Washington, D.C. due to a lot of political heat across the country. It stopped foreclosures, mandated mediation. It had outreach money for underserved farmers. It had organic standards for USDA. It had country of origin labeling. It had all kinds of good programs that are still in place. It stopped the hemorrhaging in rural America. It helped stabilize it so that then we could begin the healing process in rural America. So the Farm and Ranch Congress was an amazing undertaking, a successful undertaking by so many organizations, so many individuals out in the country. And the success of it is just amazing when you take a look at it. So with that, thanks.
Tremendous, yeah. It's and by the way, who issued the invitation to these counties to do this and come forward into a Congress?
Well, the invitation for these meetings came from Willie Nelson.
Really?
To each one of these county meetings. I mean, there were signs put up, Willie invites you to come to this county meeting, but a local person was selected that sent out the invitations, went on the radio, got on the phone, and put together these local meetings.
And that must have encouraged a lot of locals to participate, knowing that somebody like that was willing to be the lead on this thing and make it happen.
Absolutely.
All right, let's go across from Texas, where David's from, over to Georgia. Shirley Sherrod, whom I've had the privilege of knowing for a while and admiring forever, a great civil rights activist, not just in Georgia and the South, but all across this country, but also an advocate for family farmers over the years. In fact, she was a convener, she was a regional coordinator of the Farm and Ranch Congress in St. Louis, helped to pull that together. Let me just read a few names off of this list of coordinators and steering committee. Shirley, David Arnsberg, V.B. Morris out of Texas, Wayne Meyer out of California, Corky Jones, who's here with us, Ralph Page, who's with us, Dixon Terry, wonderful, great fighter out of Iowa, Howard Lyman, and Helen Waller, of course, and Merle Hansen out of Nebraska, and so many more. So many people who are giants in their local areas have been such a part of this, and Shirley has certainly been that. She was recently the director of State Director of the Rural Development of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where she had to give Barack Obama a lesson in how to stand up for your friends for a period there. But she and her husband, Charles Sherrod, founded and she's still executive director of the Southwest Georgia Project for Community Education. Shirley, why did you get involved in this Congress?
Well, of course, during that time and since, but especially during that time in the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, we were working on black land loss issues, and to be a part of this, of Farm Aid, really helped to get the message out even more about what was happening to black farmers. Now, RAF, of course, would tell you, okay, you're gonna do this, you know, and then you're thrown right into it, right? So I was given, you know, becoming a part of this effort to pull together the Farmers and Ranchers Congress, I was given the states of Georgia and South Carolina to organize and to get the delegates selected to attend the conference and Congress in St. Louis. Now, that was a bold step for Farm Aid to make, because we needed an integrated group to go from Georgia and South Carolina. That meant I had to get out in both of those states and have those meetings and get the delegates selected. This is a black person going into these areas, pulling both black and white farmers together to have them select someone from each of those meetings to attend the Farmers and Ranchers Congress. Did y'all hear what I said? This was the South now. I want you to understand how bold that was for Farm Aid to make that decision. Not a white person going in to organize and get people selected, but a black person. And I had some very, very interesting meetings, and I keep trying to remember the name of the person who helped to do the tractacade to Washington. I had a meeting right in his county, and I think everyone was concerned that I would have problems. Turns out there was no one in the Federation who could go with me to the meeting. I had worked with a white female farmer to set the meeting up, and she would call me and she said, "Baby, I'm gonna have some pickers there. We're gonna have some good times." So she's talking about the music and all that we were gonna have. But there was no one. It was on a Friday night in August, and no one could go with me. But everyone was afraid for me, because I was going in the county where this person, whose name I wish I could remember. I talked to people at Farm Aid, and they were Kersey, that was his name. Kersey was his name. And I think everyone was afraid for me because they didn't know what I would encounter at this meeting. And it was Ralph's birthday. So Ralph was wanting to come, and he was saying, no, my husband couldn't be there. He had to be somewhere else. I said, don't worry. And I can't remember the name of the woman, but she said, baby, we got this, you know. So I want you to know it was one of the better meetings I had. Now, Ralph showed up just before it was over, but it was a great meeting. And, you know, so there were these very, very good meetings that allowed the Federation to actually move out there to organize among white farmers as well. And it empowered us because we did the organizing and led those farmers to the Farmers and Ranchers Congress in St. Louis. Now, I did have a problem. One of my white farmers acted so nice. He would, after every meeting, he would help clean up and everything. He was just the nicest person there was. And as soon as we got to St. Louis and got, you know, I pulled all of my people together to say we have to, you know, they told me we needed someone for the resolution committee from our group. So rather than just choosing someone, I decided the good thing to do to help them bond even more was to have this group select someone from the group to serve on the resolution committee. So there were 5 people who wanted to do it. They asked them to go out the room, and they came back in and made a presentation to this Georgia and South Carolina group, and then they voted. And it ended up being a young black man. So black and white farmers voted, and they chose this young black man from South Carolina to serve on the resolutions committee. So I'm feeling good now because I really got everybody involved in doing this. So when we got there and got seated, I saw this farmer from Georgia talking with Ralph. I didn't know what was going on. So Ralph came to me and said, well, we have a problem. I said, what is it? He said, this guy was complaining because he didn't like the fact that this person was selected, and he just went on, and I think you need to pull the group back together. I went on and turned that name in for the resolution committee. But I pulled everyone together the next morning to say, obviously someone had a problem with the process, and we needed to deal with it. They voted again to keep the person they had selected. But he didn't give up there. I remember during the main program, this same farmer went to the floor, to the mic, it wasn't on, thank God, and he's shouting, where are the Republicans here? You know, so in other words, I won't go on, he did something else too. But he came there, he had been so nice during all of that organizing, and went there and acted like a straight fool. When we left St. Louis, I told him, don't you ever come around anything I'm doing ever again. But we had a drought. We got some corn sent in from farmers in the Midwest, and he showed up, but he wouldn't come to me, he went to my husband.
All right. The joys of organizing. Let's see, where are we? Oh, all right. Now we're going to Iowa to a guy I've known a long time, and he's not only a farmer, but and big time fighter against GMOs and Monsanto, but also a member and a leader of a terrific group called Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, which is a broad coalition of farmers, with students, with environmentalists, with labor, with teachers, with old people, young people, et cetera. It's an example of what every state should have, and they've become a force to reckon with in Iowa. And they've been around for 40 years, we're coming up on now, that Iowa's CCI has been. George Naylor, again, one of the great fighters for the family farm system of agriculture, been involved with Farm Aid from the very start. George Naylor.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you organizers, all of you advocates, all of you activists, or whatever you want to call yourselves, for everything you did, because everything you did outweighs any kind of communication or energy that I ever created and offered. But I have to thank, I guess, the fact that my parents went through a farm depression in the early 1960s, which meant that we left the farm in the 1960s and moved to California. And that was a result of policies of Ezra Taft Benson, actually, who had Earl Butz as an assistant secretary of agriculture. And Ezra Taft Benson became a popular speaker at John Birch Society meetings, and who wrote a book called Freedom to Farm. And it's interesting that one of the originators of the John Birch Society was the Koch brothers' father. So here we are today with that legacy, and we still have to deal with that kind of craziness. But, and then when I came back to the farm in 1976, and I saw the price of corn drop 50% by my second harvest. And I found out that it stopped at $1.50 a bushel only because there was a non-recourse loan at $1.50 a bushel, or it would have went even lower. And so luckily the American agricultural movement came along, and I got to learn a whole lot about parity. I got to learn about what other farmers had did in other eras. And so that was always very intriguing, and I enjoyed combining what college education I got in economics with what I was learning from real people, real farmers, and other people of like mind. And so I've been involved in trying to communicate ideas so that other people could think clearly and not just be ventriloquist dummies like the powers that be would like us all to be, and be off track on how to think right about how a democracy works and how a democratic economy works. And I'd like to thank Carolyn Mugar for having the patience to put up with me while I was supposed to be writing a policy booklet for the first United Farmer and Rancher Congress. And I don't know that she ever saw the final draft before it was published, but I think she was okay with it. But my friends delivered to the printers at 7 o'clock in the morning in Minneapolis. That was the deadline. And it's online. I don't have a copy with me right now, and it's a rare thing. But if you Google United Farmer and Rancher Congress, it'll be the first thing that comes up. And so you can look at it and read it and see where the kind of ideas that came from the American Agriculture Movement, the U.S. Farmers Association, the National Organization of Raw Materials, and the people that helped write that booklet with me. And I wish they were all here. And I can mention some of them right here. They deserve mentioning, like Merle Hansen, a great guy, Dr. Bert Henningsen Jr., Jim Dubert, Carol Hodney, of course, and I wish she was here, and Dr. Kurt Stofferan. And then Ed Marks, who is now the head of legal services in Minnesota, or in New Mexico, I mean. He was the guy that figured out how to lay it out on the new digital program, PageMaker, yes, okay. Well, anyway, I'd just like to say that I think what we're really talking about here, and I look back at what we wrote up for the United Farmer and Rancher Congress, we were kind of naive, thinking that Congress would actually do something that we thought was right, because what we were talking about was a revolutionary change in the way our economy works, and they're not a bit interested in that, and people that get them elected are not a bit interested in that. So we have to help our fellow citizens think clearly, and for instance, everybody, a common error of logic is being used. They say, well, you'd like cheap gas, you would stop at a gas station that's cheaper, right? So therefore they conclude that we'd all like cheap gas. And the same way with food. And we're supposed to think that whatever makes anything cheaper is good. So in reality, what's happening out in my neighborhood on the land is really the same thing as mountaintop removal. It's really the same as drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we all have all this commonality that we all need to get people to be thinking correctly and thinking for themselves and having that move them to action. So in my recent efforts were to write a chapter in a book called Food Movements Unite, and the name of the chapter is Without Clarity on Parity, All You Get Is Charity, and then a recent interview in Acres USA. And so that's my contribution, and I hope you all help our fellow citizens think in a revolutionary manner and not just think in some legislative or electoral thing, because we all have to start thinking more clearly and envisioning a different society and a different economy.
United Farmer and Rancher Congress. And by the way, I think I saw out there on the table, there are copies of this report from that Congress that are available to you out there. Pretty interesting. And George mentioned Ezra Taft Benson. One of his great contributions to the literature was to say that farmers need the spur of insecurity. Wouldn't it be nice if we had that for Wall Street? But that's another world. Moving right along, going now to a terrific leader and a lady and a force of nature who was a director of the National Council of Churches back in the days of the Farm Rebellion. And she played an essential role for bringing the farm cause into the faith community. And not just bringing it in, but ramming it in, demanding that they take charge of it. And did a terrific job. There's, we have to learn ways to communicate, and no way is better for a big percentage of our people than putting it in terms of morality, and the religious morality in particular. I like to remind the little right-wingers who say that they own Jesus, that if you take the word Presbyterians, here we are, and rearrange the letters, it will spell Britney Spears. Ask them what that means. But here we are, a lady whom David Center has called the beating heart of the farm movement in the faith world, Mary Ellen Lloyd.
Jim. It was a period of time among 16 denominations that were a part of my working group on domestic hunger and poverty, which I staffed in the National Division of the National Council of Churches between the fall of 1978 and the end of 1990. And it was during that time that Shirley Sherrod and I got to attend a conference over in Seoul, Korea. She is a representative of agricultural missions of the council, and I there in my role as a person from the Rural Crisis Issue Team. The Domestic Hunger and Poverty group dealt with hunger funds that members of those denominations gave during that period in our lifetime as religious people. And we took that money and it was given out to community organizations that applied in order to provide meals in the summertime when the kids weren't in school and other kinds of programs that were available, and to try to find jobs for families that had lost jobs. And as you know, the 80s was a miserable time for many, many people in this country. I always felt that I had an unusual opportunity because I had all the congregations in those 16 denominations. I had them right there on most 11 o'clocks on Sunday morning. And I had them going to their presbytery meetings and their synods and their conventions and so forth. And we needed to use all of the information we could. And primarily, some of these organizers who were heading these new farm organizations throughout the country, I needed to get them into those meetings on those program agendas so they could hear from the people who were actually working with the farmers that were in crisis. That was what I had. That was my opportunity. And when Willie Nelson called, it must have been just before the first conference, at the first concert. And he had been talking to Dave Ostendorf, who was then in Prairie Fire in Iowa. And Willie was wondering about who to give this money to from the concert, that it could be dispersed to these rural organizations. And Dave told him about the rural crisis team with the domestic hunger and poverty. And I was sitting in an ecumenical review board meeting, Prentice House, down in Greenwich Village. And a telephone call came in, and it was Dave, and he said, "Prepare yourself. You're going to get a very interesting conversation and call in a few moments." And the next thing I knew, the phone rang. I picked up the phone, and it was Willie Nelson. He identified who he was. He said to me, "At this time in the history of Farm Aid, we need some place that we can channel the funds that we gain from these concerts so that it can go out to the various rural crisis organizations that there are across the country." And I've been told that you have a rural crisis issue team that can deal with that. I thanked him very much. He said, "You'll be hearing from me." And then through the next years, the checks came until Farm Aid staff and I worked together as I began to retire from the National Council of Churches, and they took over all of the funding and the review of those funds. But at the early point of time, we used the appraisals and the applications for funds from the various rural crisis organizations across the country. And the men and women who served on the Rural Crisis Issue Team and the Ecumenical Review Board were all these staff people from your churches who were dealing with hunger funds and then dealing with the opportunity to give some of the Farm Aid funds. And that's how we managed all of that. And that's how we educated the church to better understand what the rural-urban concern was. The Lutherans, for example, who had a very strong rural church presence across the country, knew about this because they were losing their churches. So many farmers were having to give up their land that they no longer could live in their community, and so they had to move on. Or the story that came back of the banker and the farmer taking up the offering in that little rural church. And the banker was the one that was foreclosing the loan on the farmer that was walking down the aisle with him. That was such a poignant story for me, because the commitment to your rural church and the commitment to your fellowship with the members of the church that you know and in your community, but yet everything was pulling you apart. And this is where the farm organizers came in and were such a wonderful help to us. And it was a wonderful help to all of the farmers at the same time. But they needed the cash. And Farm Aid and the hunger programs and those 16 denominations, and most of all, the community organizers who committed themselves to working with the farmers to show them where there was help, and where there were people that believed in them and wanted them to survive. And in their prayers in their churches, they were asking God to give them strength and courage to sustain themselves. And so it was a network of business, a network of religion, a network of organizers. It was all of us together trying to hold ourselves up while we went through this serious, serious time. And my husband, who at that time was preaching in a Presbyterian church, I would say to him, you know, the real ministers are the ones that are the organizers going out among the people, helping them survive now. And he would agree, because he understood. So that was the big story for me. I had my hands on a lot of cash, I had my hands on a lot of money, a lot of people, and I could just put them together, and I had people like that guy, and this woman, and this guy, and all those church meetings. And you know, the church people would go out as if, my goodness, has this all been happening and I didn't know anything about it? These folks were spellbinders. They still are.
That is the power of family and the power of community and the power of churches coming together. And as you say, with community organizers, and we have one of the extraordinary community organizers with us next. He's a long time involved in and founder of, I think, the Western Organization of Resource Councils, comes out of Montana. He's not only been a community organizer, but he has run twice yearly 4-day community organizing schools in his 8-state region, I believe it is. Does Sarah Palin know this? Or she's not aware? All right. What a tremendous job he is doing and that Work is doing as well. Pat Sweeney.
Thank you, Jim. It's really an honor, privilege to be on a panel with these folks. I might bring a little different perspective, maybe, as an organizer, community organizer. I've spent the last 43 years as a community organizing. I started out with Carolyn when we were 10 years old, and so part of, and maybe a little perspective on the Farmer and Rancher Congress also. You know, I got involved with organizing when I got out of college, and one of the first leaders in our organization in Montana at Northern Plains Resource Council was none other than Helen Waller, who's here. And so I've known Helen for 40 years as an organizer, and have worked with Helen all these years, both on energy and coal and mining issues, and then of course, on family farm issues, as Helen talked about. The Farmer Rancher Congress, to me, just a couple of, I think, key points. It was a key time. It has some lessons for us, I think, to think about and maybe point us into the future, I think, as we think about it. I know one thing, or one observation, was it was a bit of a risk for Farm Aid. I think maybe moving from into being more action-oriented and developing and putting that kind of resources into organizing an effort like the Farmer Rancher Congress. So that there was a bit of risk, I think, there with Farm Aid really stepping out in a much bigger way on the policy side, which I think was a testimony to the courage of Farm Aid recognizing the moment we were in and putting up the resources to actually do the organizing work there. And attempting to pull together unity that was not as visible in the countryside, frankly. I think the Farmer Rancher Congress had a couple of things that were important ingredients, and you just heard one of them from George. One was sort of a vision, you know, a statement of policy, a statement of principles and values. And people like George and Mark and everybody in this panel and many of you in the audience. By the way, how many people here today were actually at the Farmer Rancher Congress in St. Louis? Raise your hands if you were at, well, there's one of our the field organizer in the back there, I see. So there are, you know, several people here obviously who participated in the Congress. But I think one of the lessons of the Farmer Rancher Congress is the fact that farmers came together and thought about the solutions and their analysis, their collective analysis of what was going on. George and many others were, you know, in my mind, Helen, all these people, incredible about figuring out what the hell was the problem, what was the underlying problem, and what are really farmer-led, community-led solutions to that problem. And that's an important thing. It wasn't something that was brought down from the top down, it was from the bottom up in the context of the vision and the policy. I would say one other lesson was that it was very grassroots, and that there was a serious amount of organization. I think as Jim or somebody said, none of these things happen, you know, just by happenstance. I mean, there was a field program that was developed, as Shirley talked about. There were 32 field organizers that we were part of recruiting around the country. There was a training session, if I remember, that we ran, right, for all the field organizers before they went out. And there was a huge task that was very specific to these organizers to pull off the field meetings and to get delegates elected. And there were, you know, we did nearly 500 meetings around the country, touching, you know, over 15,000 people when you figure out the total numbers, between 15 and 20,000 people who came to those sessions in a very short period of time. That is not a small task to do. And each one of those was very well done. And I think the other part about that that's important is people listened, that it was not prescribed, that these sessions people came to, there was a lot of varied opinions, but people came to these sessions and people listened, we scribed what they wanted to, what they said, and we pulled that together. And as others have said, there was an amazing amount of unity in the pieces that came out of those sessions. So I think one lesson there about grassroots vision from farmers and our folks who are thinking about solutions, the organization that goes into pulling off something like this are things that are there. I would end with two things. To me, one of the most important outcomes of that Congress is a principle in organizing about building relationships. One of the most important things we can do as organizers and leaders is build that network of relationships that we have in our own communities. And I think if you look around this room 30 years with Farm Aid, Farm Aid has been part of building the most important rural grassroots leadership relationships you can find in this country. And we all owe a thank you to Willie and Carolyn and all of Farm Aid for being a network provider that brings and builds those relationships, which makes us much more powerful today than we would be without it. So thank you, Farm Aid.
Well, what Pat and everybody up here knows is that to have a coalition, the coalition has to be a part of the planning and the structuring and the forming of it, not invited in at the last. And I recall Jesse Jackson, I think, said this at the Farm and Ranch Congress, was that we might not all have come over on the same boat, but we're in the same boat now. That's a powerful political reality when that comes together. And Mark Ritchie has been practicing that, not only through his Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy in those years, but as Secretary of State in Minnesota and in his current work and throughout his life, bringing people together, pulling them in and getting them to work together. That's what builds a movement. Mark Ritchie.
Thank you, Jim. And I want to urge all of you to pull this out of your packet or grab another one or whatever and take the time to read it. It's an incredible summary, first, of what came out of it. And we've only touched a little bit on the amazing political work and economic and policy and the relationships. But the other thing is that it also spells out some of the elements that this panel and these individuals have talked about. Several of us before we were saying, you know, we think of the Farmer and Rancher Congress as that thing in St. Louis. Yeah, it was big, a couple thousand people, it was incredible. Nobody slept. I mean, it was amazing. These things came out of it. But what it really was those 500 or more meetings around the country that were incredibly well organized, incredibly well led. And one of the critical factors of that was, of course, the quality of the organizers. Another really critical factor was tapping somebody like Ellen Kurz to be the national organizing director. She happens to be in the room here because she happens to be in Chicago for this event. Ellen, you can read a little more about Ellen and what she did, but what I want to do is close with what Ellen had to say about all of you. This is from her, the field coordinator for the whole thing. I just want to say that in my experience, this is a woman who did national politics and has done national politics for 40 years, and she was less than 10 when she started. I just want to say that in my experience, the majority of those state coordinators were some of the best organizers I've ever worked with. They were so energetic and smart and professional. They were incredible. And despite all the pressures, they worked beautifully together as a group during the Congress. The secret sauce of this was the high quality people helping to lead and organize and train out in the field, doing the organizing, chairing those amazing meetings, getting those lists that David talked about, getting everybody there. This was one of the high points in this nation's history of organizing. We've had some high points. There were so many things that came out of it. I can feel the pressure for another experience, but it's not for another big meeting someplace. That's important as part of this. It's another opportunity to do the kind of grassroots organizing, careful training, careful putting together, building up these relationships, and then propelling a new generation of organizers because they've seen, experienced what high level but carefully and thoughtfully trained organizing feels like. To me, what this first Farmer and Rancher Congress gave us was a whole lot of momentum, and a lot of things happened at that time. And I feel like, you know, that got said, and it's really settled out in here. But it also gives us something that few movements really have the opportunity to have. You can't really recreate the March on Washington. I'd say now, you can't do that. You can't recreate Seneca Falls, I don't think. But you know, we could do another damn Farmer Rancher Congress, organizing in more than 39 states and more than 44 states in every single state. We can get our neighbors for some other countries that are nearby who kind of work with us on all this stuff. We could organize again. We could do more. We could have an opportunity to leave a legacy for those who will come behind us. We did it. We can do it again. Thank you.